I'm Edward, your host, and it's a pleasure to share this quiet moment with you. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what was your very first job? Write it below and subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, settle back and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. A brooch taken from blue tissue paper. St. Mary Mead, in late April, wore the look of a village that had tidied itself for inspection. The spring bulbs had finished their show and been properly dead-headed. The hedges stood clipped to a uniform height that suggested both prosperity and restraint. Even the gossip, which was never entirely absent from village life, had been trimmed back to a respectable murmur, the sort that could be mistaken for concern rather than curiosity. It was the season when everything looked its best, and everyone knew it. The church roof, however, did not look its best, and had not for some time, hence the restoration tea at Rosemere House, hosted by Mrs. Leonora Pritchard, with that particular combination of generosity and exactitude that marked her approach to charitable works. Miss Marple had arrived with Lady Bantry, who was known to everyone as Dolly, and who possessed the comfortable sort of title that did not require one to stand on ceremony. Dolly had driven them in her motor car, a journey of perhaps 10 minutes that she treated as a minor expedition, complete with commentary on who had planted what in their front gardens, and whether the new people at Laurel Cottage were settling in properly. Rosemere House stood at the edge of the village, a solid brick dwelling of no particular architectural distinction but considerable respectability. It had belonged to the Pritchard family for 2 generations, and Mrs. Leonora Pritchard had inherited it along with a modest but reliable income and a sense of duty that would have done credit to a minor royal. The drawing room had been arranged with chairs along the walls and 2 small tables near the windows, each covered with a lace cloth that showed no trace of having been folded. Mrs. Pritchard herself stood near the fireplace, receiving guests with the sort of gracious precision that made one feel both welcomed and gently assessed. She was a widow of perhaps 60 years, dressed in black lace over grey silk, with pearls at her throat that were certainly real and certainly inherited. Her face was handsome rather than beautiful, with the kind of bone structure that suggested character had been earned rather than bestowed. Her hair, still dark with only a dignified touch of grey at the temples, was arranged in a style that had been fashionable 20 years ago, and which she saw no reason to alter. But it was not her dress or her bearing that drew the eye. Pinned to her bodice, rather higher than one might have expected, and at a slight angle as though she had placed it there with some reluctance, was an emerald brooch of quite remarkable beauty. Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her knitting bag beside her, observed the effect of the brooch upon the assembled company with quiet interest. A room full of people, she had often noticed, behaved very much like a pond when a stone was dropped into it. There were ripples, and the ripples told their own story. Clara Wynne, Mrs. Pritchard's companion, had come forward with a teacup for Miss Marple. Miss Wynne was a woman of perhaps 40, with the kind of face that one forgot almost immediately after meeting. She was dressed in a sensible brown dress with a white collar, her hair pulled back neatly, her manner efficient without being obtrusive. She moved through the room like someone who had learned to take up very little space, and she did it so well that most people barely noticed she was there. "Mrs. Pritchard has been so looking forward to this afternoon," Miss Wynne said softly, setting the cup down with great care. "She does so enjoy being useful." Miss Marple thanked her, and watched as the younger woman moved away, her eyes never quite leaving Mrs. Pritchard, as though she were a shepherd who could not quite trust the sheep to manage without her. Gerald Harlow, the church warden, had positioned himself near the tea table with the air of a man supervising a military operation. He was a pleasant-looking gentleman of middle age, with thinning fair hair and the sort of face that inspired confidence without quite explaining why. His suit was beautifully pressed, his collar spotless, and his manner suggested that he took his responsibilities with becoming seriousness. "A splendid turnout," he was saying to the vicar's wife, Mrs. Sylvia Chase, who stood beside him with a smile that managed to be both warm and watchful. "Mrs. Pritchard has been most generous as always, most generous indeed." Mrs. Chase was a handsome woman in her late 40s, with the kind of amiable competence that made her invaluable to parish life. She wore a dress of soft green that suited her colouring, and she had the gift of making everyone feel that their presence mattered, while simultaneously keeping track of who had taken more than one slice of cake. "The brooch is quite extraordinary, is it not?" she said, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearby. "I had no idea Mrs. Pritchard possessed such a piece. How long has it been since we saw it last, Mr. Harlow?" "Oh, a great many years, I should think," Harlow replied, his tone carefully neutral. "A great many years indeed." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she observed the small drama unfolding around the emerald brooch. Several guests had already made admiring comments, their voices perhaps a touch too loud, their praise a fraction too emphatic. Mrs. Pritchard had accepted the compliments with gracious nods, but there was something in her manner that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with the attention. 20 years at least," said a voice behind Miss Marple. It belonged to Nora Pike, a small bright-eyed woman who served as the village's unofficial chronicler of events. She had a way of appearing wherever something interesting was being discussed, and her memory for dates and details was both remarkable and occasionally inconvenient. "I remember when she wore it to the church fete in 34. There was some talk about it then, though I couldn't say what exactly. Something to do with the person who gave it to her, I believe." Miss Marple murmured something appropriately vague and continued with her knitting. It was a useful occupation at gatherings such as these. People tended to speak more freely around someone who appeared to be absorbed in stitches and patterns. Near the window, a gentleman in a well-cut suit was examining the brooch with what appeared to be professional interest. This, Miss Marple knew from Dolly's whispered commentary, was Edward Searle, a jeweller from Much Benham, the larger town some 5 miles distant. He had been invited, Dolly explained, because Mrs. Pritchard sometimes consulted him about insurance valuations and such matters. Mr. Searle had a smooth, reassuring manner that must have been useful in his trade. His hair was silver, his hands immaculate, and his expression one of cultivated appreciation. "A fine piece," he was saying to Mrs. Pritchard. "Very fine indeed. The setting is quite old, I should say. Georgian, perhaps early Victorian. The stones are of excellent quality. You've kept it very well, Mrs. Pritchard." "It has been in storage," Mrs. Pritchard replied, and something in her tone suggested the matter was closed. "In blue tissue paper, quite safe. I thought it time it saw daylight again." But her hand, Miss Marple noticed, moved briefly to the brooch as she spoke, not in a gesture of pride, but rather as though checking it was still securely fastened. It was pinned, as Miss Marple had observed, rather higher than fashion would dictate and at a slight angle, as if Mrs. Pritchard did not entirely trust it to remain in place. The afternoon progressed in the manner of such gatherings. Tea was poured, cake was consumed, and the church roof fund benefited by several pounds and a promise of a jumble sale to come. The conversation flowed along comfortable channels, touching on the weather, the garden show planned for June, and the health of various parish members. But Miss Marple, who'd spent a lifetime observing people in drawing-rooms and at tea-tables, noticed something that gave her pause. Most of the guests had looked at the brooch with interest, curiosity, or simple admiration. But one person had looked at it and gone quite still, the way a rabbit goes still when it catches the scent of a fox. It was only for a moment, and the expression had been carefully schooled back into something more appropriate. But Miss Marple had seen it, and she filed it away in that part of her mind where she kept such observations, waiting to see if it might mean something or nothing at all. The guests began to take their leave as the afternoon drew towards evening. Mrs. Pritchard stood at the door, thanking each person with exactly the right degree of warmth. Clara Wynne moved quietly in the background, collecting cups and straightening cushions with the practised efficiency of someone who knew her place and kept to it. Miss Marple and Dolly were among the last to depart. As they reached the door, Miss Marple glanced back and saw Mrs. Pritchard's hand move once more to the brooch, that small, uncertain gesture that spoke of something more than mere vanity. "Such a lovely afternoon," Dolly said as they settled into the motor car. "Though I must say that brooch was rather unexpected. I wonder what prompted Leonora to bring it out after all this time." Miss Marple said nothing, but her fingers moved steadily with her knitting as Dolly navigated the short drive home. She was thinking about brooches and blue tissue paper, about pride and uncertainty, and about the way one person in that pleasant drawing room had looked at a piece of jewellery as though it represented something far more complicated than mere beauty or value. It was not yet clear what it might mean, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the smallest observations often mattered most in the end, and so she tucked the afternoon's impressions away like stitches in a pattern that would only reveal its design when one stepped back to see the whole. Chapter 2. The Garden Step with No Scuff Mark. The telephone call came to Miss Marple's cottage just after 9:30 that evening, which was late enough to be alarming and early enough to suggest something more than mere illness. It was Dolly Bantry, her voice carrying that particular quality of controlled distress that well-bred women employ when disaster has arrived without warning. "Jane, I've just heard from Dr. Haydock. There's been an accident at Rosemere House. Mrs. Pritchard has had a fall. I'm afraid it's rather serious." Miss Marple set down her knitting with care. "How serious, Dolly?" There was a pause, the kind that precedes bad news delivered with reluctance. "I'm afraid she's dead, Jane. They found her in the garden about an hour ago. Dr. Haydock is there now, and Inspector Slack has been sent for. I thought perhaps we might go over, if you felt it appropriate. Clara Wynne is quite beside herself, apparently." 20 minutes later, Miss Marple was being helped from Dolly's motor car in front of Rosemere House. The building looked much as it had that afternoon, solid and respectable in the gathering darkness, but there was something altered about it now, as though death had changed the very air around it. The front door stood open, casting a rectangle of light across the gravel drive. Inside, voices could be heard, low and urgent, the kind of voices people use when catastrophe has made ordinary conversation seem improper. Clara Wynne met them in the hallway. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and her hands twisted together in a gesture that spoke of helplessness rather than mere grief. She had changed from her brown afternoon dress into something darker, though whether from respect or simply because the evening had grown cool, Miss Marple could not tell. "Lady Bantry, Miss Marple, how good of you to come," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I hardly know what to do. The doctor is in the drawing-room, and the inspector is expected at any moment. It's all so dreadful, so very dreadful." Dolly put a comforting hand on the younger woman's arm. "Tell us what happened, my dear, when you're ready." Miss Wynne took a steadying breath. Mrs. Pritchard went out into the garden after dinner. She said she wanted to check the side gate, as she always did before retiring. She was most particular about such things, you know. "I was in the kitchen, putting away the tea things from this afternoon. I heard a sound from outside, not quite a cry, more of a thud. By the time I reached the garden door, she was already lying at the foot of the terrace steps." Dr. Haydock emerged from the drawing-room at that moment, his medical bag in hand and his expression set in the neutral lines that doctors learn to wear. He was a man of middle years, grey-haired and reliable, who had attended half the village through measles, influenza, and the various ailments that flesh is heir to. "Lady Bantry, Miss Marple," he said with a brief nod. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done. Mrs. Pritchard died from a broken neck. It would have been instantaneous. She cannot have suffered." "A fall, then?" Dolly asked, though the question seemed almost superfluous. "So it appears. The steps from the terrace to the garden path are damp at this time of year, and there's moss on the edges. Not dangerous in daylight, perhaps, but treacherous enough in the dark for someone not watching their footing." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes had already moved toward the garden door, visible through the hallway. Beyond it, she could see the faint glow of what must be a lantern, marking the place where Mrs. Pritchard had been found. The sound of a motor car announced the arrival of Inspector Slack, who entered with his customary air of a man determined not to be trifled with by civilian nonsense. He was a large, red-faced gentleman who treated most situations as though they were personal affronts to his authority. "Right then," he said, removing his hat with more force than necessary. Let's have the facts. Dr. Haydock, you've examined the deceased? I have. Death from a broken neck, consistent with a fall. I'd estimate the time of death at somewhere between 8 and 9 o'clock this evening. And the household? Miss Wynne stepped forward. Just myself and Mrs. Pritchard, Inspector. The daily woman left at 4 o'clock, as she always does. There's a gardener who comes 3 times a week, but he wasn't here today. Slack pulled out his notebook with an air of grim satisfaction. We'll need to see where it happened. Show me. They proceeded through the drawing room and out onto the terrace, a small company of the living following in the wake of death. The terrace was paved with flat stones, still slightly damp from an afternoon shower that Miss Marple had barely noticed. 2 shallow steps, perhaps 8 inches each in height, led down to a gravel path that curved away toward the side gate. A lantern had been placed on the gravel, illuminating the scene with a wavering yellow light. Mrs. Pritchard's body had been moved, Miss Marple assumed, but the place where she had lain was still visible, a darker patch on the pale stone. Inspector Slack examined the steps with the thoroughness of a man who trusted nothing he had not seen for himself. He pointed to the edges, where moss had indeed gathered in the crevices. There's your culprit, he said with satisfaction. Damp stone, moss, poor light. A woman of her age should have known better than to go wandering about in the dark. Miss Marple, standing slightly behind the others, studied the steps with quiet attention. They were broad and shallow, the sort of steps that even an elderly person could navigate with reasonable confidence. The surface was smooth but not polished, and while there was moisture from the evening air, it was hardly what one would call treacherous. What interested her more was what she did not see when someone slipped on steps, particularly stone steps with moss and dampness. There was usually some evidence of the moment, some mark left by a heel or toe scrabbling for purchase. But these steps showed no such mark, no rough scrape or scuffed patch where a foot might have skidded. The fall, if fall it was, looked remarkably clean. Miss Wynne, she said gently, you mentioned that Mrs. Pritchard went to check the side gate as she always did. Was this truly a regular habit of hers? Clara Wynne nodded, still twisting her hands together. Every evening, Miss Marple. She was most particular about it. The gate latch sometimes works loose, you see, and she worried about prowlers. Not that we've ever had any trouble, but she felt it her responsibility to keep the house secure. I see. And she went alone? Always. She said there was no need for both of us to traipse about in the dark. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the lantern on the gravel. That lantern, Miss Wynne. Where does it usually stand? Miss Wynne blinked at the question. Why, on the hook by the garden door, Miss Marple, where it always stands. But it's here now, on the path. I brought it out when I came to look for her, Miss Wynne said, a note of defensiveness entering her voice. I needed light to see by. Inspector Slack made an impatient sound. I don't see what the position of a lantern has to do with anything. The facts are clear enough. Mrs. Pritchard came out to check her gate, missed her footing in the dark, and fell. Tragic, but hardly mysterious. From the shadows near the house, another voice spoke with the comfortable authority of someone used to pronouncing certainties. Gerald Harlow, the church warden, had arrived at some point, though Miss Marple had not noticed him approach. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression one of sombre determination. An accident, he said firmly. A tragic accident, but an accident nonetheless. Poor Mrs. Pritchard. She was a fine woman, a pillar of the community. We must see that her memory is honoured properly. The words were appropriate, even admirable. Yet something in the way he spoke them, the slight emphasis on the word accident, the quickness with which he offered his conclusion, made Miss Marple think of someone distributing a verdict before the jury had quite finished deliberating. She said nothing, merely nodded in the vague way that elderly ladies are permitted to nod, as though her thoughts were on other matters entirely. But her mind was very much engaged, turning over the small oddities that were beginning to accumulate like pins in a cushion. The steps with no scuff mark, the lantern that had been moved, and somewhere in the background of her thoughts, like a melody played just out of hearing, the memory of an emerald brooch worn for the first time in 20 years, pinned rather higher than it should have been, as though its owner did not entirely trust it to stay where it was placed. Dr. Haydock was speaking of arrangements, Inspector Slack of procedures. Clara Wynne wept quietly into a handkerchief. Gerald Harlow stood like a guardian of propriety, ensuring that everything was done with proper respect. And Miss Marple, her knitting bag held loosely at her side, wondered about falls that left no marks, and people who spoke too quickly of accidents, and whether anyone had thought to ask the one question that seemed most obvious. Where exactly was the emerald brooch now? Chapter 3, Green Wax on a Prayer Book Ribbon. The church on Sunday morning wore its most solemn aspect, though the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows seemed determined to offer a note of consolation. The congregation had assembled with that particular blend of sorrow and curiosity that marked village response to unexpected death, and the pews were fuller than they might have been on an ordinary Sunday in late April. Miss Marple sat in her customary place 3 rows from the front on the left-hand side, with Dolly Bantry beside her. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was a thin, earnest man with greying hair and a voice that carried well without ever becoming strident. He had chosen his text with care, speaking of generosity and the transient nature of earthly possessions in a way that managed to be both comforting and gently admonitory. Clara Wynne occupied the front pew, dressed in unrelieved black, her face partially obscured by a veil. She sat very straight, her gloved hands folded in her lap, the picture of properly managed grief. Gerald Harlow sat 2 rows behind, his expression appropriately grave, while Sylvia Chase, the vicar's wife, had positioned herself near the organ where she could observe the congregation with the practised eye of someone accustomed to noting who attended and who did not. The service proceeded along familiar lines. Hymns were sung with restrained feeling, prayers offered with genuine emotion if not quite uniform sincerity. Mr. Clement spoke of Mrs. Pritchard's many charitable works, her dedication to the church roof fund, her unfailing support of parish activities. It was a fitting tribute, and several ladies in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs that had been brought for precisely that purpose. During the final hymn, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Chase's attention had wandered from the hymnal to the front pew, where Clara Wynne stood with bowed head. There was something in Mrs. Chase's expression that suggested assessment rather than sympathy, as though she were measuring some quality in the younger woman and finding the result significant. After the service concluded, the congregation emerged into the churchyard with that mixture of relief and reluctance that follows sombre occasions. Small groups formed naturally, voices lowered to appropriate levels as people exchanged condolences and speculation in roughly equal measure. Dolly moved toward Mrs. Chase with the evident intention of offering comfort, and Miss Marple accompanied her, though her own purpose was perhaps less straightforward. Mrs. Chase received their sympathies with gracious composure, her smile managing to convey both sadness at the loss and appreciation for the community's support. "Such a dreadful shock," she said, her voice carrying that particular quality of concern that came naturally to a vicar's wife. "Poor Mrs. Pritchard. And poor Miss Wynne, of course. I cannot imagine how she must be feeling, to have been in the house when it happened and to have heard that terrible sound." "She seems to be bearing up remarkably well," Dolly observed, glancing toward where Clara Wynne stood accepting condolences from a small circle of parishioners. "She's a strong young woman," Mrs. Chase replied. "Very capable. Mrs. Pritchard was fortunate to have such devoted assistants in her final years." Miss Marple murmured something vague and looked toward the church entrance, where Mr. Clement had paused to speak with Gerald Harlow. "I wonder if I might borrow one of the prayer books," she said to Mrs. Chase. "I found the vicar's choice of text quite moving, and I should like to read it again more carefully at home." "Of course, Miss Marple. There are several in the vestry. Shall I fetch one for you?" "Oh, I wouldn't dream of troubling you. If you'll just point me in the right direction, I'm sure I can manage." The vestry was a small, tidy room that smelled of old wood and candle wax. A desk stood against one wall, its surface neat except for a stack of service sheets and a length of ribbon used, Miss Marple supposed, as a bookmark for the large Bible that lay open on the lectern. She picked up one of the prayer books and was reaching for the ribbon to mark the page when she noticed something that made her pause. There was a smear on the ribbon, faint but distinct, a greenish colour that caught the light with an odd glossy sheen. It looked very much like wax, though not the plain beeswax that burned in the church candles. Miss Marple held the ribbon closer to the window, examining it with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly intricate piece of knitting. The wax was definitely green, a rich emerald shade, and it had the smooth texture of sealing wax rather than candle drippings. Moreover, it appeared fresh, for it still held a slight tackiness when she touched it very gently with her fingertip. It was an odd place for such wax to appear. The church did not use coloured candles, and there was no particular reason for sealing wax to be present in a vestry. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Pritchard's household, which Clara Wynne had described as using only plain beeswax for the candlesticks. She thought too of the emerald brooch, still unaccounted for, and wondered if green might be a colour that carried some significance beyond mere decoration. When she emerged from the vestry, prayer book in hand and ribbon carefully replaced, she found Dolly in conversation with Nora Pike, who had evidently been waiting to share some piece of information that she deemed important. "Such a loss to the village," Nora was saying with the sort of emphasis that suggested she had been saying it regularly since the previous evening. Mrs. Pritchard was always so careful about everything. Not the sort of woman to go stumbling about in the dark, I shouldn't have thought. Though I suppose age catches up with all of us eventually. Dolly made a sympathetic noise, and Miss Marple joined them with a small smile. "Mrs. Pritchard struck me as remarkably steady on her feet," she observed mildly. "I noticed yesterday afternoon that she moved quite confidently, even when carrying that heavy tea tray." "Ah, but that was in daylight," Nora said with the air of someone who had considered all angles. "Everything is different in the dark, isn't it? And she had been excited about the brooch, I expect. Pride goes before a fall, as they say, though one oughtn't to speak ill of the dead." It was the second time Miss Marple had heard pride mentioned in connection with Mrs. Pritchard and the brooch. She filed the observation away alongside the other small curiosities that were beginning to accumulate. As they walked back toward Dolly's motor car, Miss Marple glanced back at the church, where Mrs. Chase stood in the doorway speaking with her husband. The vicar's wife had her hands clasped in front of her, and even from a distance Miss Marple could detect a certain tension in her posture, as though she were holding something back through sheer force of will. When Mrs. Chase raised one hand to brush a strand of hair from her face, Miss Marple caught a faint scent carried on the breeze. Lavender certainly, which was common enough, but beneath it, something sharper and more chemical, like furniture polish or perhaps metal cleaner. "People tidy when they are frightened," Miss Marple remarked to Dolly as they settled into the motor car, though she said it so quietly that it might have been mistaken for a comment on the weather. Dolly glanced at her friend with curiosity. "I beg your pardon, Jane?" "Just a thought, my dear," Miss Marple replied, smoothing her gloves with care. "Just a thought about dust and the ways people try to manage it." She said nothing more as they drove back through the village, but her mind was busy with ribbons and wax, with scents that did not quite belong, and with the uncomfortable possibility that tidying when done in haste and fear might sometimes do more harm than good. Chapter 4, The Photograph That Was Turned Face Down. Inspector Slack had taken it upon himself to conduct what he called a proper investigation, which meant in practice that he interviewed people with barely concealed impatience and took notes that suggested he had already reached his conclusions. On Monday afternoon, Miss Marple learned from Dolly that he had spent the morning at Rosemere House examining Mrs. Pritchard's papers and asking Clara Wynne questions about household routines. "Apparently he's satisfied it was an accident," Dolly reported over tea at Miss Marple's cottage, "though he's making Clara show him all the financial records just to be thorough. Something about insurance policies and wills. The poor girl is quite exhausted by it all." Miss Marple poured more tea and considered this information. "I suppose it's natural that the inspector should wish to be thorough, though I confess I should like to see Mrs. Pritchard's house myself, if only to pay my respects properly. Do you think Miss Wynne would find it intrusive if we called?" "I shouldn't think so," Dolly replied. "In fact, she might welcome the company. Gerald Harlow has been hovering about with condolences and offers of assistance, which is kind of him but probably rather wearing. They arrived at Rosemere House shortly after 3:00, when the afternoon light gave the brick facade a softer appearance than it had possessed on the night of Mrs. Pritchard's death. Clara Wynne received them in the drawing-room, which had been restored to perfect order since the Restoration tea. Not a cushion sat askew, not a cup remained out of place. "Lady Bantry, Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you to call," Clara said, gesturing them toward the sofa. Her eyes were still red-rimmed, but her composure had returned, that particular variety of composure that came from knowing one's duty and performing it correctly. "I've just been showing Inspector Slack the household accounts. He seemed to think there might be some irregularity, though I cannot imagine what. Mrs. Pritchard was meticulous about such matters." "I'm sure you are equally meticulous in managing them," Dolly said kindly. "You always struck me as remarkably efficient." A faint colour touched Clara's cheeks. "I tried to be. Mrs. Pritchard had very high standards. She believed that charity work, to be truly useful, must be conducted with the same precision one would bring to any business matter. The church roof fund alone required careful documentation of every penny donated and spent." As Clara spoke, she moved about the room with small, nervous gestures, straightening a picture frame here, adjusting an antimacassar there. Miss Marple watched these movements with quiet interest, noting how the younger woman's hands seemed unable to remain still. On a side table near the window stood a small cabinet with glass doors, the sort used for storing important papers. Clara moved toward it now, clearly intending to demonstrate her organisational skills to her visitors. "Everything is arranged by category," she explained, opening the cabinet to reveal neat stacks of envelopes and folders, donation receipts, correspondence with the diocese, lists of contributors. Mrs. Pritchard insisted that transparency was essential in charitable work. She said that people's generosity deserved to be honoured with perfect accuracy. Miss Marple rose from the sofa and approached the cabinet, ostensibly to admire this display of order, but her attention had been caught by something else entirely. On the same table, just beside the cabinet, sat a framed photograph that had been turned face down. "Oh dear," Clara said quickly, following Miss Marple's gaze. "That must have fallen over. How careless of me not to notice." Her hand moved to right the photograph, but Miss Marple, with the sort of gentle insistence that elderly ladies can employ without giving offence, reached it first. "Please allow me," she said, lifting the frame with careful hands. The photograph showed two women, both young and dressed in the fashion of perhaps 30 years earlier. One of them was unmistakably Mrs. Pritchard, her face softer and less severe than it had become in later years, but with the same strong bone structure and direct gaze. The other woman was beautiful in a more conventional way, with delicate features and an expression of pure delight. She wore a light-coloured dress with lace at the collar, and pinned to her bodice was the emerald brooch, catching the light exactly as it had done at the Restoration tea. Miss Marple turned the frame over with care. On the back, in faded ink but still clearly legible, were the words, "For L. Who saved me." The room had gone very quiet. Clara Wynne's face had undergone a subtle transformation, a flicker of something that might have been pain or anger, or perhaps both, quickly suppressed beneath a mask of dutiful affection. "That was Mrs. Pritchard's dearest friend," Clara said, her voice carefully controlled. "They were very close many years ago. The photograph is quite old, as you can see." "The lady is wearing the brooch," Miss Marple observed mildly, setting the photograph upright on the table. "How lovely it looks on her. Was she the person who gave it to Mrs. Pritchard, do you suppose?" Clara's hands tightened into small fists, then deliberately relaxed. "I believe it was the other way around, actually. Mrs. Pritchard gave it to her friend as a token of their affection. Later, when circumstances changed, it was returned. But these are old family matters, Miss Marple, private sentimentalities that hardly seem relevant now." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, returning to her seat, "give an old woman's curiosity. It's just that the brooch was so very striking when Mrs. Pritchard wore it on Saturday. I couldn't help but wonder about its history. At that moment, Gerald Harlow arrived, announced by a knock at the front door that Clara hurried to answer. He entered the drawing room, carrying a covered dish and wearing an expression of earnest solicitude. "Miss Wynne, I've brought a casserole from Mrs. Harlow," he said, setting it to her down on the sideboard. "She thought you might not feel like preparing meals just now. We're all so very concerned about you." His voice carried genuine warmth, but there was something else beneath it, a note of careful management. He glanced at the photograph now standing upright on the table, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I see you've been looking at old family pictures," he said, moving with deliberate casualness to turn the conversation. "Mrs. Pritchard was very fond of her memories, though she wasn't one to dwell on the past. She always said it was better to look forward, to think of what good might still be done. That's the legacy we must honour, I think. Her charitable spirit, her dedication to the community." He spoke for several more minutes, offering comfort and reassurance in the manner of someone well practised in such duties. But Miss Marple noticed that he positioned himself between the table and the visitors, as though the photograph were something that required protection or perhaps concealment. When they took their leave a short while later, Miss Marple carried with her the image of that turned-down frame, of Clara Wynne's expression when it was righted, and of Gerald Harlow's smooth redirection away from what he had called old family sentimentalities. In the motor car, Dolly was thoughtful. That photograph seemed to distress Clara rather badly, didn't it? Though she tried to hide it. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "She tried very hard indeed, which makes one wonder why, if sentiment is truly harmless, so many people seem frightened of it." She said nothing more, but her mind was occupied with photographs and inscriptions, with friendships saved and brooches given and returned, and with the small mysteries that families keep locked away in cabinets with glass doors, visible to all who care to look, but rarely examined closely enough to understand what they truly mean. Chapter 5: A Glove Laid Out to be Noticed. Inspector Slack had established himself in the vicarage parlour on Tuesday morning, a location chosen less for comfort than for its central position in village affairs. He had summoned various guests from the Restoration tea, with the air of a man who expected cooperation, and would tolerate no foolishness in the provision of it. Miss Marple had not been summoned, but she happened to be returning a book to Mrs. Chase, when Edward Searle, the jeweller from Much Benham, arrived for his interview. The vicar's wife invited Miss Marple to wait in the morning room while she attended to some parish correspondence, and the morning room, as it happened, shared a wall with the parlour. The wall was thin and voices carried. Mr. Searle's voice was smooth and professional, the sort that inspired confidence in matters of valuation and authenticity. He was explaining the history of the Emerald Brooch with the careful precision of someone accustomed to dealing with valuable objects and anxious owners. "The setting is definitely late Georgian, Inspector, possibly around 1820 or 30. The craftsmanship is excellent, the stones of very fine quality. I valued it at approximately £400, though its sentimental worth to Mrs. Pritchard was clearly far greater." "And the clasp?" Slack's voice was gruff, impatient with details that seemed irrelevant to his notion of investigation. "Old-fashioned but quite secure, Inspector. The sort that requires a firm hand to open, not the kind of thing that would simply fall off, if that's what you're wondering." There was a pause, the sound of papers being shuffled. Then Mr. Searle spoke again, his tone more hesitant. "There is one small matter, Inspector, which may be of no importance whatsoever. Last week, on Wednesday I believe it was, Mrs. Pritchard came to my shop in Much Benham. She was accompanied by a young lady who asked several questions about resetting stones, particularly emeralds, whether they could be removed from an old setting and placed in something more modern. And this young lady was? I assumed it was Miss Wynne, her companion, though I confess I didn't pay particularly close attention. The young lady did most of the talking while Mrs. Pritchard simply listened. She seemed rather opposed to the idea, actually, said something about the setting being part of the piece's history and not to be tampered with. When Miss Marple encountered Inspector Slack leaving the vicarage some 20 minutes later, he was in the sort of mood that suggested he had gathered facts without quite seeing how they fitted together. He nodded to her with perfunctory courtesy and climbed into his motorcar with the air of a man who had places to be and little patience for elderly ladies who happened to be standing in his path. Miss Marple watched him drive away, then turned back to find Mrs. Chase at the door, her expression troubled. "The inspector has been asking the most peculiar question," she said, ushering Miss Marple inside, "about who left the tea early, who might have used the cloakroom, who could have had access to the brooch, as though someone had deliberately stolen it, rather than Mrs. Pritchard simply losing it in the fall." "Has the brooch not been found, then?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Not yet. Inspector Slack seems to think it might have fallen into the garden somewhere, or perhaps rolled under a bush. He's had constables searching the grounds this morning." They had moved into the hallway as they spoke, and Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the small cloakroom that opened off to the left. It was the sort of room that every well-appointed house possessed, a place for guests to leave their outdoor things during social occasions. "I wonder," Miss Marple said diffidently, "if I might refresh my memory of Saturday afternoon. I seem to recall hanging my coat in here, but cannot quite picture where I placed it. My memory is not what it was, I'm afraid." Mrs. Chase opened the cloakroom door obligingly. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I'm sure your memory is as sharp as ever. I often wish mine were half so reliable." The cloakroom was narrow but adequate, with hooks along one wall and a small bench against the other. On the bench sat a single glove, placed with what seemed deliberate care rather than the carelessness of something forgotten. Miss Marple picked it up, noting its quality. It was a lady's glove, fawn-coloured leather, well made but showing signs of wear. At the thumb there was a fine tear, barely noticeable unless one looked closely. But what drew Miss Marple's attention more particularly was the dark line at the cuff, a smudge that might have been soot or perhaps the residue from contact with blackened metal. "Someone has left this behind," she observed, holding it up for Mrs. Chase to see. "How careless, though I suppose in all the upset. On Saturday evening it's hardly surprising that small items were overlooked." Mrs. Chase frowned slightly. "I noticed it yesterday when I was tidying. I assumed it belonged to one of the ladies from the tea, though I couldn't say which one. I set it there thinking the owner might return for it, but no one has claimed it yet." "The metal polish on it is rather distinctive," Miss Marple said, examining the smudge more closely. "The sort that comes from touching something that's been recently blackened. An iron railing, perhaps, or a lantern hook." She said it casually, as one might remark on the weather, but her mind was very much engaged with the image of the garden lantern that had been moved from its usual hook by the door. A hook that would need occasional blackening to prevent rust, a hook that someone reaching in haste might brush against, leaving just such a mark on a glove. Mrs. Chase had gone rather quiet, her earlier ease replaced by something more guarded. "I'm sure there are any number of explanations," she said, taking the glove from Miss Marple and setting it back on the bench, with what seemed unnecessary precision. "Metal polish is common enough in households. We use it ourselves on the church candlesticks." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "And yet it does seem odd, doesn't it, that someone would place the glove so carefully on the bench rather than simply dropping it, almost as though they wanted it to be noticed, to serve as evidence of some kind." She let the observation hang in the air between them, gentle but unmistakable. Mrs. Chase made a small sound that might have been agreement or dismissal. It was difficult to tell which. When Miss Marple left the vicarage a few minutes later, she carried with her several new pieces of information, each small in itself, but potentially significant when placed alongside the others. Clara Wynne had apparently visited the jeweller's shop to inquire about resetting stones, though she had denied going to Much Benham that month. The brooch remained missing despite thorough searching, and someone had left a glove in a cloakroom placed rather than dropped, marked with the sort of smudge that came from touching a recently blackened lantern hook. She thought of hands reaching in haste, of garden lanterns moved from their accustomed places, of stories arranged as carefully as napkins on a tea table. She thought too of Inspector Slack's methodical questioning, his collection of practical facts that would eventually form a pattern, though perhaps not the pattern he expected to find. At home, she settled into her armchair with her knitting, her fingers working automatically while her mind turned over the small mysteries that were beginning to accumulate. Each clue seemed innocuous enough when considered alone, but together they suggested something more complex than a simple accident on garden steps, something that involved planning and concealment and the careful management of appearances. The emerald brooch had drawn attention like a candle draws moths, she had thought on Saturday afternoon. Now it had vanished, and in its absence other things had begun to show themselves. A photograph turned face down, green wax where no wax should be, a glove placed to be noticed marked with evidence of haste. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she considered these matters. She had learned long ago that the smallest details often mattered most, that people revealed themselves not in grand gestures, but in tiny inconsistencies, in the way they arranged objects or chose their words or failed to meet one's eyes when certain subjects were mentioned. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone knew what had happened to the emerald brooch. Someone knew why Mrs. Pritchard had really gone into the garden that night, and whether she had gone alone or by invitation. Someone understood the significance of that turned-down photograph, and why the thought of old family sentimentalities made respectable people nervous, and Miss Marple, sitting peacefully in her cottage with her knitting in her lap, was beginning to form certain ideas about who that someone might be. Chapter 6. A receipt folded into a hymn sheet. Wednesday brought rain, the sort of gentle, persistent drizzle that turned the village paths to mud and gave everyone an excuse to call upon their neighbours, rather than venture further afield. Miss Marple received Nora Pike mid-morning, when the rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the windows, and the fire in the sitting room had been coaxed into cheerful cooperation. Nora arrived with her mackintosh dripping and her spirits undampened, carrying a basket covered with a checked cloth that proved to contain fresh scones from the bakery. She had the look of someone bursting with information that required immediate sharing, though she made a creditable show of discussing the weather and the state of the roads before arriving at her true purpose. "I've been thinking about Saturday night," she said, accepting a cup of tea with evident satisfaction. "About poor Mrs. Pritchard and that dreadful accident, though I must say, Miss Marple, there are one or two small things that have been troubling me. Nothing important, perhaps, but odd nonetheless." Miss Marple settled into her chair with an expression of polite interest. She had known Nora Pike long enough to understand that information offered as unimportant was often precisely the opposite, and that the appearance of casual gossip frequently concealed observations of considerable value. "I was putting my cat out on Saturday night," Nora continued, warming to her subject. "Harold is very particular about his evening constitutional, you know. It must be at precisely 11 o'clock, or he becomes quite impossible. Well, I happened to notice someone posting a letter at the pillar box on the corner. After 11 o'clock, Miss Marple. I thought it rather unusual, as the last collection is at 6, and there seemed no particular urgency that couldn't wait until morning." "Could you see who it was?" Miss Marple asked, her needles moving steadily through a row of stitches. "The light isn't good there, especially in the rain, but it was definitely a woman, and she was walking quickly, as though she didn't wish to be seen. She went back toward the vicarage. I'm fairly certain of that." Miss Marple considered this information with the careful attention it deserved. The vicarage stood at one end of the village green, within easy walking distance of both Rosemere House and the church. A letter posted after 11 o'clock on the night of Mrs. Pritchard's death suggested either great urgency or considerable anxiety about its contents. "How interesting, she murmured. "I wonder what correspondence could have been so pressing on such a distressing evening." Nora leaned forward conspiratorially. "That's what I thought, though of course it may have been perfectly innocent. Mrs. Chase is very conscientious about her parish duties. Perhaps she was posting notices for the jumble sale or some such thing." After Nora had departed, leaving behind the cheese, scones and a general atmosphere of satisfied speculation, Miss Marple sat for some time in thought. The rain continued its gentle assault on the windows, creating a soothing backdrop for contemplation. She thought about letters posted in haste, about green wax on ribbons, and about the vicar's wife who smelled of lavender and something sharper. By afternoon, the rain had diminished to a fine mist, and Miss Marple decided that a visit to the vicarage would not be entirely unreasonable. She had, after all, borrowed that prayer book on Sunday, and courtesy dictated that she should return it promptly. The fact that she might also have an opportunity to observe Mrs. Chase more closely was merely incidental. Mrs. Chase received her in the vicarage parlour with her customary warmth, though Miss Marple detected a certain weariness beneath the social pleasantries. The vicar's wife looked as though she had not been sleeping well, and there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested anxiety, carefully controlled. "How kind of you to return the prayer book in person, Mrs. Chase said, taking it with hands that trembled very slightly. "You might simply have brought it on Sunday." "I know how these things accumulate," Miss Marple replied gently, "and I confess I've been meaning to call. You seemed rather troubled after the service, and I wanted to assure you that the whole village appreciates how difficult this must be for you. Such a shock and so much additional work for the vicar." Mrs. Chase's smile was grateful but strained. "You're very thoughtful, Miss Marple. Yes, it has been rather overwhelming. The funeral arrangements to coordinate, the correspondence with the diocese about memorial services, the letters of condolence to acknowledge. Sometimes I think the administrative burden of parish life exceeds even the spiritual demands." She gestured toward her desk, which was indeed covered with papers and envelopes in various stages of organisation. A wastebasket stood beside it, partially filled with discarded drafts and crumpled correspondence. "I completely understand," Miss Marple said, moving closer to admire the efficient arrangement. "You've always been so wonderfully organised. I remember thinking at the Restoration tea how smoothly everything ran, thanks to your careful planning." As she spoke, her eye was caught by something in the wastebasket. A hymn sheet from Sunday's service, folded with unusual tightness and then apparently discarded. It was the sort of detail that most people would overlook, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime noticing what others missed. "Oh dear," she said, bending slightly as though her handkerchief had fallen. "How clumsy of me." In the moment it took to retrieve the imaginary handkerchief, she glimpsed what the hymn sheet had contained. A small slip of paper still partially visible within the folds, a receipt from a shop in Much Benham dated the previous Saturday afternoon. The items listed were brief but telling. 1 stick of green sealing wax, 1 narrow ribbon. When she straightened, Mrs. Chase had moved to the window, her back to the room, her shoulders held with rigid control. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, not turning round, "may I ask you something in confidence?" "Of course, my dear." If someone had done something with the very best of intentions, something meant to protect rather than harm, but which might be misunderstood by those who didn't know the full circumstances, would you think that person deserving of censure? It was a carefully worded question, the sort that sought reassurance without quite admitting the need for it. Miss Marple considered her response with equal care. "I think," she said slowly, "that intentions matter a great deal. But I also think that protection sometimes becomes concealment, and concealment can prevent justice from being properly served. Even when done from the kindest motives, it can cause more harm than the truth would have done." Mrs. Chase turned then, her face pale but composed. "The church fete," she said with a brightness that did not quite reach her eyes. "The receipt you saw, it was for supplies for the church fete labels. We always order them well in advance, though I realise it may seem peculiar to do so when the fete is still months away." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, gathering her things to leave, "though I confess I've never heard of using sealing wax for labels. It seems rather elaborate for such a purpose." The observation hung in the air between them, gentle but unmistakable. Mrs. Chase said nothing, but her hands moved to smooth her skirt in a gesture that spoke of nervousness imperfectly concealed. As Miss Marple walked home through the mist, she reflected on the curious uses to which sealing wax might be put. It was, as she had noted before, the material one used for closing what one did not wish opened. An envelope, perhaps, containing something that required both security and a certain formality of presentation. She thought of Nora Pike's observation about the late posting, of Mrs. Chase's evident distress, and of the green wax smear on the church ribbon. She thought too of Clara Wynn's devotion to Mrs. Pritchard, of turned down photographs and denied visits to jewellers, and of the way grief could sometimes be so carefully managed that it began to look like something else entirely. At home, she made herself a pot of tea and settled once more with her knitting. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern now, though the complete picture remained just out of reach. But Miss Marple had learned patience over many years of observation. The truth, she knew, had a way of revealing itself to those willing to watch and wait, to notice the small inconsistencies that others dismissed as insignificant. Sealing wax was not used for church fate labels. That much was certain. The question remained, what was it used for instead? And why did a vicar's wife find it necessary to purchase such an item on the very afternoon that Mrs. Pritchard wore her emerald brooch for the first time in 20 years? The rain had stopped entirely now, and a weak sun was attempting to break through the clouds. Miss Marple watched it for a moment, then returned her attention to her knitting, her mind working as steadily as her fingers, weaving together threads that would eventually reveal their pattern in full. Chapter 7. Gravel, Raked in the Wrong Direction. Thursday morning arrived clear and bright, the sort of day that made the previous day's rain seem like something half-remembered from a different season entirely. Miss Marple had woken with a sense of purpose, the kind that came when disparate threads began weaving themselves into something approaching coherence. She wished to see the garden at Rosemere House in proper daylight, to examine the scene of Mrs. Pritchard's fall without the distraction of grief and official investigation. Clara Wynn, when approached with this request, seemed both surprised and relieved. "Of course, Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you to wish to see where it happened. I confess I've been avoiding that part of the garden myself, though I know that's rather foolish. Mrs. Pritchard would have said one must face unpleasant things squarely rather than skulking around them." She led Miss Marple through the drawing-room and out onto the terrace, moving with the careful steps of someone traversing ground that had become uncertain. The garden looked peaceful in the morning light, well-tended and orderly, showing no outward sign of the tragedy that had occurred there. The two shallow steps remained as they had been on Saturday night, broad, solid, their edges slightly softened by moss. Miss Marple examined them with quiet attention, noting again the absence of any scuff mark or scrape that might indicate a panicked loss of balance. "The gardener came on Monday," Clara said, following Miss Marple's gaze. "He tidied the gravel path. It seemed the decent thing to do to make everything look proper again. Gerald Harlow suggested it, actually. He said it would be easier for everyone if the garden didn't look so disturbed." Miss Marple's interest sharpened at this information. She moved past the steps to the gravel path that curved toward the side gate, studying it with the same careful attention she'd given to the steps themselves. The gravel had indeed been raked, and recently. The lines were neat and uniform, the sort of tidying that spoke of practiced efficiency. But something about the pattern struck Miss Marple as odd. The rake marks ran towards the steps rather than away from them, as though whoever had done the work had started at the gate and worked backward, drawing the gravel in the wrong direction. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple had spent many years tending her own modest garden, and she knew that the natural way to rake a path was to work from the house outward, pushing debris away rather than pulling it toward the more frequented areas. To rake from the gate inward suggested either unusual methodology or considerable haste. "Did the gardener mention why he chose to work in that particular direction?" Miss Marple asked, her tone one of mild curiosity rather than suspicion. Clara looked puzzled. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Miss Marple. Does it matter which way one rakes gravel?" "Perhaps not," Miss Marple replied gently. "I was merely curious. Old gardeners have their habits, you see, and I've always been interested in the small variations in technique." She moved along the path slowly, her eyes scanning the gravel and the narrow border of soil where it met the lawn. Near the terrace, where the gravel thinned slightly, something caught her attention. A small depression in the soil, no larger than a shilling, with a peculiar shape to it. Not round like a footprint, but elongated and slightly curved, as though something metal had been pressed down and then lifted away. Miss Marple knelt with some difficulty, her joints protesting the movement, and examined the mark more closely. It had the distinctive impression of a clasp or fastening, the sort of mark that might be left by a brooch pin pressed into soft earth during a moment of struggle or sudden movement. "Are you quite all right, Miss Marple?" Clara's voice held genuine concern. "Please, don't trouble yourself. The garden is rather damp still from the rain." "I'm perfectly well, my dear," Miss Marple assured her, accepting Clara's offered hand to rise. "Just an old woman's foolish fancy. I thought I saw something interesting in the soil, but it was nothing of consequence." They walked together toward the side gate, which stood at the far end of the path. The gate itself was unremarkable, a simple wooden structure with a metal latch that showed signs of regular use but no recent disturbance. The bolt that Clara had mentioned moved smoothly when tested, showing no indication of having worked loose. "Mrs. Pritchard checked this every evening?" Miss Marple asked, running her fingers lightly over the latch. "Without fail," Clara confirmed. "She was most particular about security, even though we've never had any trouble. She said it was better to be careful than sorry." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yet if Mrs. Pritchard had indeed come out to check the gate, why had the gravel been raked in a way that suggested someone had worked to obscure evidence near the terrace rather than near the gate itself? And why had Gerald Harlow been so quick to suggest tidying the garden when visitors had not yet been officially invited to call? As they returned to the house, Gerald Harlow himself appeared, arriving with his customary air of helpful authority. He carried a ledger under his arm and greeted them with appropriate solemnity. "Miss Wynne, I've brought the church roof fund accounts for you to review," he said, then noticed Miss Marple with evident surprise. "Miss Marple, how unexpected! I trust you're not finding your visit too distressing." "Not at all, Mr. Harlow. I was merely paying my respects. The garden is very beautiful, and I'm sure Mrs. Pritchard took great pride in maintaining it." "Indeed she did," Harlow agreed with perhaps more emphasis than necessary. "Everything always in its proper place, everything orderly and correct. The gardener raked the path on Monday morning at my suggestion. I thought it important to make things decent for visitors. One cannot have evidence of tragedy on display for all to see." There was that word again. Decent. Miss Marple had heard it several times now in connection with the garden, always spoken with a slight emphasis, as though decency was something that required active enforcement rather than natural expression. "How thoughtful of you," she murmured. "Though I confess I'm surprised the gardener worked from the gate inward. Most gardeners I've known prefer to work the other way." Harlow's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into its usual pleasant composure. "I couldn't say, Miss Marple. I'm not much of a gardener myself. I simply asked him to make the path look tidy, and he obliged." But Miss Marple, watching him carefully, thought that his answer had come a fraction too quickly, and that the subject of raking patterns seemed to cause him more discomfort than such a trivial matter warranted. As she walked home later, she reflected on decency and tidying, on gravel raked to conceal rather than to beautify, and on the small mark in the soil that suggested something had been pressed down and lifted away into the vicinity of the terrace. She thought too of Gerald Harlow's quick suggestion to make things decent, and of the way people used respectability as a blanket, as she had observed to Dolly, over things that were still warm. Decency, Miss Marple had learned over many years, was a virtue when honestly pursued, but when invoked too quickly and too often, it sometimes served a purpose quite different from its apparent one. It became not a shield for propriety, but a screen for concealment, a way of arranging the truth into shapes more palatable than reality itself. And in this case, she suspected that someone had been very anxious indeed to arrange things properly, to smooth over evidence of what had really happened on those shallow steps, and to ensure that the garden told a story of simple accident rather than something considerably more complicated. Chapter 8. The wrong person remembered the clasp. Inspector Slack had decided to conduct a second round of interviews on Friday afternoon, this time with what he termed a more focused approach. Miss Marple learned of this from Dr. Haydock, who stopped by her cottage on his way back from a call in the village and accepted the offer of tea with the air of a man grateful for a moment's respite. "Slack's convinced himself there's something not quite right about the whole business," Dr. Haydock said, stirring sugar into his cup. "Can't say I blame him. £400 worth of jewellery doesn't simply vanish into thin air, accident or no accident. He's been asking the most extraordinary questions about who stood where at the tea, who might have had opportunity, who left the room and when." "And has he discovered anything of significance?" Miss Marple asked, her needles moving steadily through their familiar pattern. "Nothing concrete, just a lot of vague memories and polite contradictions. You know how it is with these things. Everyone remembers something different, and half of them are remembering what they think they should remember rather than what actually occurred." After Dr. Haydock departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in contemplation. The question of memory was indeed an interesting one. People's recollections were notoriously unreliable, coloured by expectation and desire, and the very human tendency to construct narratives that made comfortable sense. Yet sometimes she had found it was precisely those small variations in memory that revealed the most significant truths. By Saturday morning, the results of Inspector Slack's interviews had begun to circulate through the village with the efficiency that only genuine curiosity could achieve. Nora Pike, encountered at the post office, was full of information about who had been questioned and what they had said. The inspector was particularly interested in the brooch itself, Nora reported, with barely suppressed excitement. He asked everyone who had examined it closely to describe how the clasp worked. Apparently several people gave him the same answer. They all said it snapped from left to right. Quite certain about it, they were. Miss Marple, who had been selecting stamps with apparent absorption, looked up with mild interest. "How curious! And was that correct?" "That's just the thing," Nora said, lowering her voice to what she clearly considered a confidential volume. "Edward Searle, the jeweller, told the inspector that the clasp actually snapped from right to left. Some peculiarity of the old Georgian setting, apparently. He demonstrated it with one of his own pieces to show how it worked." This information occupied Miss Marple's thoughts considerably as she walked home. A clasp that worked in an unusual direction was not the sort of thing one would know from casual observation. To speak of it with certainty suggested either very close examination or actual handling of the piece. That evening, Dolly Bantry arrived unexpectedly, her motorcar pulling up just as Miss Marple was considering her supper arrangements. She bustled in with the energy of someone bursting with news. "Jane, you'll never believe what Slack told me," she said, settling herself without ceremony into Miss Marple's most comfortable chair. "He's been comparing everyone's statements about the brooch, and he's noticed something rather odd. Several people described the clasp mechanism with perfect confidence, but they all got it backward. All except one person, that is." "And who was that?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Clara Wynne. She described it correctly when Slack questioned her on Thursday. Said it snapped right to left, and she was quite specific about it. When he asked how she knew, she said Mrs. Pritchard had shown her how to fasten it properly when they were preparing for the tea." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands, but her mind was working rapidly. Clara Wynne had indeed handled the brooch, had understood its mechanism well enough to describe it accurately. Yet she had also claimed never to have visited Much Benham in recent weeks, despite Edward Searle's statement about a young lady asking questions about resetting stones. "There's something else," Dolly continued, accepting her cup. "Slack asked Clara about her movements on Saturday evening, and she was quite definite about having been in the kitchen putting away cups when she heard the sound from the garden. But Mrs. Chase mentioned to him that she'd passed the kitchen on her way home from the tea and noticed it was already tidy, with all the cups washed and put away. That was around 6:30, more than an hour before Mrs. Pritchard's fall." "Perhaps Miss Wynne tidied the kitchen twice," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "Some people are very particular about such things. That's what she said when Slack questioned her about it, but her manner was odd, apparently. She became quite flustered and kept explaining how important it was to keep everything in order, how Mrs. Pritchard insisted on proper household management. She went on about it rather too much, Slack thought. Miss Marple was reminded of her earlier observation to Dolly about people who tidied when they were frightened. Clara Wynne seemed to have been doing a great deal of tidying, kitchen cups, garden gravel, household accounts, and now her statements about her movements on Saturday evening had proven inconsistent with other evidence. Clara has been remarkably devoted to Mrs. Pritchard's memory, Miss Marple observed. Almost protective of it, one might say, as though she feels responsible for ensuring everything is presented in the proper light. Yes, Dolly agreed, though I confess I'm not sure what to make of it all. Slack seems to think she knows more than she's saying, but he can't quite put his finger on what exactly she might be concealing. After Dolly departed, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and considered the question of Clara Wynne's devotion. Devotion was generally an admirable quality, particularly in a companion whose position required both loyalty and discretion. Yet devotion could sometimes shade into something less admirable when it crossed the line from service to possession, from gratitude to resentment. She thought of the photograph showing Mrs. Pritchard's beautiful friend wearing the emerald brooch, of the inscription thanking someone who had saved her. She thought of Clara's expression when that photograph had been turned right side up, that flicker of emotion quickly suppressed. She thought too of the young lady who had asked about resetting stones, and of Clara's insistence that she had never visited Much Benham. And she thought about the brooch clasp, remembered correctly by someone who had handled it closely enough to understand its peculiarities. Only one person would speak of such details with certainty, someone who had examined it carefully, perhaps while removing it from its owner after an unexpected fall on garden steps. The pattern was becoming clearer now, though several pieces remained stubbornly out of place. Miss Marple had learned patience over many years of solving small village mysteries. The truth would reveal itself eventually, not through dramatic revelations, but through the steady accumulation of small inconsistencies through questions that received answers a beat too quickly, or explanations that protested too much. Clara Wynne's kindness had become rehearsed, her devotion too emphatic, her helpfulness arriving a moment too soon. She had begun finishing other people's sentences for them, arranging their memories as carefully as she arranged household accounts, ensuring that everything was presented with proper decorum. But underneath that careful arrangement, Miss Marple suspected, lay something considerably more complicated than simple devotion, something that involved old debts and family grievances, emerald brooches given and reclaimed, and the dangerous territory where gratitude curdles into obligation and obligation into resentment. The question that remained was not whether Clara Wynne knew what had happened on Saturday night, but rather what exactly her role had been, and whether her knowledge stemmed from observation or from something far more direct. Chapter 9, 3 Small Lies Told for Decency. Sunday afternoon found Miss Marple taking tea with Dolly Bantry at Gossington Hall, a comfortable arrangement that allowed for conversation without the formality of proper visit. The drawing-room window stood open to admit the mild spring air, and somewhere in the distance a lawn-mower could be heard pursuing its methodical course across the grass. Dolly had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, and Miss Marple, who knew her friend well, recognised the signs of someone wrestling with troublesome thoughts. When the tea things had been cleared and they were settled with their cups, Dolly finally spoke what was on her mind. "Jane, I've been thinking about poor Mrs. Pritchard and that dreadful night. There are things that don't quite add up, aren't there? Small things, perhaps, but they trouble me nonetheless." Miss Marple set down her cup with care. "I've noticed certain inconsistencies myself. Would you like to hear them?" "Please," Dolly said with evident relief. "I feel as though I'm seeing shadows where there should be none, but I can't quite dismiss them." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts with the precision she might bring to counting stitches. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but exact. "There are 3 small lies," she said, "each told, I believe, for what the teller would call decency. The first concerns Mrs. Pritchard's evening routine. Clara Wynne said that Mrs. Pritchard went out to check the side gate as she always did, implying it was a habitual action requiring no explanation. Yet when I examined the gate on Thursday, the bolt showed no fresh scraping, no sign of recent use. If Mrs. Pritchard truly checked it every evening, one would expect to see evidence of regular handling. Dolly leaned forward, her expression intent. You think Clara lied about why Mrs. Pritchard went into the garden? I think Clara provided an explanation that sounded plausible and required no further investigation, but the physical evidence suggests the gate was not the true reason for that particular excursion. And the second lie? Dolly asked. The photograph, Miss Marple continued. Clara said it had fallen over in the night, implying accident rather than intention. Yet when I examined it, the stand was perfectly steady, and the cloth beneath it showed no wrinkling or disturbance. Someone had turned that photograph face down deliberately, and I suspect it was turned down because the sight of it caused distress. The woman in the photograph, Dolly murmured, the one wearing the brooch. Precisely. The inscription suggested a debt of gratitude, a life saved by Mrs. Pritchard's intervention. But gratitude can be a complicated burden, particularly when it extends across generations. And the third lie? Miss Marple's expression grew more troubled. The garden being raked for visitors. Gerald Harlow said it was done to make things decent, to prepare for callers. Yet on Monday morning, when the raking occurred, no visitors had yet been told they might call. The funeral arrangements had not been announced. No formal morning visits arranged. The raking was done not for visitors, but to obscure something that needed obscuring. Dolly was quiet for a long moment. You're saying that someone deliberately smoothed over evidence of what really happened? I'm saying that the garden was made to tell a particular story, just as the photograph was hidden to suppress another story, and Clara's explanation about the gate was offered to forestall questions about Mrs. Pritchard's true purpose in going outside. But why? Dolly asked, though her voice suggested she was beginning to understand. If it was truly an accident, why would anyone need to arrange the evidence? Miss Marple thought of a sewing circle many years ago, when a respectable woman had hidden a bruise beneath a brooch, and everyone had helped her do it because one mustn't talk. It had not been kindness then, and she suspected it was not kindness now. Because, she said quietly, there are people who believe that appearances matter more than truth, that scandal must be avoided even at the cost of justice. They tell themselves they are protecting others, maintaining standards, preserving decency. But what they are really doing is protecting themselves from uncomfortable realities. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage, where she had asked to take tea with Sylvia Chase. The vicar's wife received her with composure, though Miss Marple detected the same strain she had observed before, the tightness around the eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and burdensome knowledge. They spoke of parish matters for a time, of the upcoming fete, and the choir's need for new hymnals. But eventually, as Miss Marple had known it would, the conversation turned to Mrs. Pritchard and the tragedy that had befallen her. The whole village is unsettled, Mrs. Chase said, pouring more tea with hands that trembled very slightly. People don't know quite what to think. Inspector Slack's questions have stirred up doubts, and doubt is such an uncomfortable thing to live with. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, though sometimes doubt is necessary, sometimes certainty comes too quickly and serves purposes other than truth. She paused, then spoke with deliberate gentleness. I've been thinking about green sealing wax, Mrs. Chase. It's not a common item in most households these days. One might use it for very special correspondence, or perhaps for securing something that required both privacy and a certain formality of presentation. Mrs. Chase's teacup rattled very slightly against its saucer. As I mentioned, it was for the church fete labels. Of course, Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested she believed no such thing. And yet it seems such an elaborate choice for labels. One wonders what might require both green wax and narrow ribbon, purchased on the very afternoon that Mrs. Pritchard wore her emerald brooch for the first time in 20 years. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Chase's eyes moved just once toward the drawer of her writing desk, the same drawer Miss Marple had noticed on her previous visit. It was the briefest of glances, quickly suppressed, but it told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. "Mrs. Chase," Miss Marple said very gently, "I believe you discovered something on Saturday night, something that frightened you very much, and I believe you made a decision to protect someone, to shield them from consequences you felt would be too severe. You told yourself it was an act of Christian charity, of village loyalty. But concealment, even when motivated by kindness, is not the same as kindness itself." Sylvia Chase's composure wavered, then held. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "I think you do," Miss Marple replied, her voice still gentle but inexorable. "I think you found an envelope sealed with green wax, an envelope that contained something very important, and rather than bring it to the attention of the authorities, you hid it, telling yourself you were preventing scandal, protecting the dignity of the deceased and the reputation of the living." Mrs. Chase's hands gripped her teacup with such force that her knuckles showed white. "If what you suggest were true, and I'm not saying it is, would that not have been the compassionate thing to do? To spare people additional pain?" "Compassion," Miss Marple said quietly, "must sometimes yield to justice, and concealing evidence of wrongdoing, however well-intentioned, serves neither the living nor the dead." She rose to leave, gathering her things with unhurried movements. At the door she paused and looked back at the vicar's wife, whose face had gone very pale. "The truth has a way of emerging, Mrs. Chase. No matter how carefully we try to manage it, it would be far better if it emerged honestly through proper channels than if it were forced out by suspicion and investigation. I hope you'll consider that." As she walked home through the quiet village streets, Miss Marple reflected that the 3 small lies had all been told for what their tellers considered good reasons. But lies, she had learned, were like weeds in a garden. They might start small and well-intentioned, but they grew and spread and eventually choked out the truth entirely. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, sealed with green wax and hidden for the sake of decency, lay evidence that would illuminate what had truly happened on those garden steps on a quiet Saturday evening in April. Chapter 10. Brooch, Wax and a Fall in the Dark. The vicarage parlour on Monday afternoon held an atmosphere of quiet tension, the sort that precedes revelations long delayed. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace with his arms folded, his expression caught between irritation at amateur interference and grudging respect for results. Dolly Bantry occupied the sofa, her usual cheerfulness subdued by apprehension. Sylvia Chase sat very straight in an armchair, her face pale but composed in that particular way that indicated fear held in check by force of will alone. Miss Marple had requested this gathering with an apologetic diffidence that fooled no one present. She sat in her customary manner, her knitting bag beside her, her hands folded peacefully in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but precise. "I believe it's time we understood what truly happened on Saturday evening," she began. "Not the story we've been told, which was arranged to look like a simple accident, but the actual sequence of events that led to Mrs. Pritchard's death." Slack shifted his weight impatiently. "If you've got evidence, Miss Marple, you should have brought it to me directly, rather than staging theatrical gatherings." "I have no physical evidence, Inspector, only observations. But I believe Mrs. Chase may be able to provide what you require, if she chooses to do so." All eyes turned to the vicar's wife, whose composure wavered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "What truly happened," Miss Marple continued softly, "begins not on Saturday evening, but many years earlier. The woman in the photograph, the beautiful lady wearing the emerald brooch, was saved from scandal by Mrs. Pritchard's discreet intervention. That woman was Clara Wynne's mother." A small sound escaped Mrs. Chase's lips, quickly suppressed. "The brooch was given as thanks," Miss Marple went on, "a token of profound gratitude. But later, when another scandal threatened, Mrs. Pritchard reclaimed it for safekeeping. It was, I suspect, meant kindly, a way of protecting the Wynne family from further temptation or difficulty. But Clara grew up with this knowledge, and gratitude polished itself into something harder. She came to see her family's debt not as a blessing, but as a leash, a perpetual obligation that could never be fully discharged. "This is speculation," Slack interjected, though his tone suggested he was listening carefully. "Perhaps," Miss Marple acknowledged, "but it explains why Clara sought employment as Mrs. Pritchard's companion, not merely for the position, but to be near the brooch, to understand what it represented. And it explains why she visited the jeweller in Much Benham, asking about resetting stones. She wanted the brooch changed, transformed into something that belonged to her rather than to her mother's debt." She paused, allowing this to settle. On Saturday evening, after the guests had departed and the tea things were cleared, Clara confronted Mrs. Pritchard in the garden. Not violently, not with any intention of harm, simply with a request that the brooch be given to her permanently, that the old debt be considered paid. But Mrs. Pritchard refused. She intended to leave the brooch in her will, but on her own terms, in her own time. She was, you see, a woman who believed in doing good properly, which sometimes meant doing it exactly as she saw fit. Dolly leaned forward. And then Clara reached for the brooch, Miss Marple said quietly. Perhaps to take it, perhaps simply in frustration. Mrs. Pritchard turned sharply away, and Clara in that moment gave a small push, not meant as violence, only to stop Mrs. Pritchard from walking away from the conversation, but the step was directly behind Mrs. Pritchard. She fell cleanly, too cleanly, and died at once. The room had gone very still. Even Inspector Slack had ceased his restless movements. What followed, Miss Marple continued, was panic and an attempt to make things look proper. Clara unpinned the brooch and took it, but she could not bear the ugliness of what had occurred. She turned the photograph face down because she could not look at her mother's face. She moved the garden lantern to suggest Mrs. Pritchard had missed her footing in poor light. And she raked the gravel the wrong way, smoothing towards the steps to erase evidence of the brief struggle near the terrace. "The clasp mark in the soil," Slack said suddenly. "That's what you noticed on Thursday." Yes, a small impression where the brooch had been pressed into the earth during that moment of confrontation. Clara tried to smooth it away, but one cannot rake soil as effectively as gravel. Miss Marple's gaze moved to Sylvia Chase, whose hands were gripping the arms of her chair with considerable force. The brooch was slipped into an envelope and sealed with green wax, not for theft, but for control. Clara intended to post it to herself under another name, so it would arrive later, as an anonymous return, making the story clean and complete. But Mrs. Chase discovered the sealed envelope. Sylvia Chase's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "I found it in the church on Sunday morning. It had been left in the vestry, hidden behind the hymn books. I didn't know what it contained at first, but the wax was so distinctive, and when I touched it, some transferred to the ribbon I was using." "And you hid it?" Miss Marple said gently, "telling yourself you were protecting the village from scandal." "I didn't know what to do," Mrs. Chase said, her composure finally breaking. "I couldn't imagine Clara doing such a thing deliberately. I thought perhaps it was an accident and she'd panicked, and if I brought it forward it would only make things worse. I thought I was being merciful." Inspector Slack's voice was flat. "Where is the envelope now, Mrs. Chase?" With trembling hands, Sylvia Chase rose and moved to her writing desk. From the drawer Miss Marple had observed she withdrew an envelope sealed with emerald green wax. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I truly thought I was doing the right thing." Slack took the envelope and broke the seal. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, lay the emerald brooch, its stones catching the afternoon light exactly as they had done at the restoration tea. 3 clues mattered most, Miss Marple said into the silence that followed. The step with no scuff mark, not a stumble but a clean backward fall. The green sealing wax where it did not belong. The brooch was managed, not simply lost. And the clasp remembered the wrong way by most people, but correctly by Clara, who had handled it closely enough to know its peculiarities. Slack's expression was grim. "So we've 2 sorts of guilt. One that kills, and one that tidies." The door opened then, and Clara Wynne entered, summoned by a constable who had been sent to fetch her. She took in the scene, the brooch on the table, the broken seal, the faces turned toward her, and her careful composure crumbled. "I only wanted it back," she said, not quite crying but close to it. "I only wanted it to be finished. The debt, the obligation, the constant reminder that my mother had been saved and we owed everything to Mrs. Pritchard's discretion. I didn't mean to hurt her. I truly didn't. But she wouldn't listen, and she turned away, and I just reached out to stop her, and then—" She broke off, her hands covering her face. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with shame. "I tried to make it look proper. I thought if it seemed like an accident, if the brooch simply disappeared, well, everyone could remember her with respect, and I could return it anonymously later, and it would all be finished. I didn't think about justice or truth. I only thought about tidiness, about making things decent." Miss Marple regarded her with compassion tempered by sadness. "Wanting things finished, my dear, is how people begin a dreadful work, and calling it decency does not make it kind." Inspector Slack moved forward to perform his duty, and Clara allowed herself to be led away with the passive acceptance of someone too exhausted for further resistance. Mrs. Chase wept quietly, her own guilt at concealment less severe but no less real. When only Miss Marple and Dolly remained, sitting in the quiet parlour with the emerald brooch between them, Dolly spoke softly. "Such a small thing to cause so much tragedy. Just a piece of jewellery." "Not small to them," Miss Marple replied. "It represented salvation and obligation, gratitude and resentment, everything that family debt can become when it's carried across generations. The brooch was made heavy by what people asked it to carry." She looked at the emerald stone, still gleaming despite everything. "Mrs. Pritchard meant well, I think, but there's a kind of charity that becomes its own form of tyranny, a kindness that never allows the recipient to feel free of obligation, and Clara, growing up in the shadow of that debt, came to hate the very thing her mother had cherished." Outside the vicarage windows, St. Mary Mead continued its daily routines, but for a time tea would be poured a little more quietly, and compliments would be offered with less certainty, as though the village had remembered, briefly, that respectability was not the same thing as goodness, and that the careful arrangement of appearances could sometimes conceal truths that desperately needed telling. The emerald brooch, when it was finally returned to Mrs. Pritchard's estate, would be sold to settle her affairs. Its beauty remained undimmed, but it would never again be worn with pride or pleasure. Some objects, Miss Marple reflected, absorb too much of human complexity to ever be simply ornamental again. And in the quiet of her cottage that evening,